All right, I guess we might as well get started. Anybody who comes in after a little bit can just pick up where they can. Let me go back to March here. Today's our last class period in March. So today the goal is to go over anything that you want me to talk about from the from the Gulliver's Travels study guide. Also, I'm going to do the introduction to the Romantic period and show you that unit that popped up on the blackboard. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the midterm. Most people did pretty well on the midterm. I didn't write down any of the statistics, but most people did all right. There were, I think, 3 100s. So there were people that were just so well prepared that, you know, they got all their points. And then there were some people that did all right, but maybe not as good as they could have done. I think the lowest score overall was in the 40s. So I just wanted to mention before we start with our material for today that the final exam is just like the midterm, except with the second half of the material for the course. So it's structured exactly the same way with the same types of questions, except that it will be over all the stuff that we have done since we got back from spring break. So starting with Gulliver's Travels. So I guess the reason I'm mentioning that is because if your performance on the midterm wasn't what you had in mind, then I think that you would do well to maybe try some new things during this last half of the course and prepare for the final exam to kind of make up for it. So here are some things that you could do. Number one, you could make sure that you're taking thorough notes. You should be taking notes on the lectures. You should be taking notes on your reading assignments. All that should be written down. Some people will say, well, I read it and that's good enough, and I'll just remember whatever it is that you talked about, and that's fine, but that could be contributing to, you know, sort of a general understanding of the material and not a specific understanding of the material. Lots of people lost points on their responses because their answers were kind of general and not specific enough to convince me that they had read the material. So that's one thing that you could do. Another thing that you could do is, you know, make sure that your attendance is good. And if you happen to be out for whatever reason, that you go ahead and watch the video of class that you can find in the content material on Blackboard and also on the main page of Blackboard right here where it says class video playlist. You can go to that link and all of the classes are listed there. So I would recommend doing that. I think there were some tests where the person made maybe a 70 or a 72 and they had 2 or 3 answers that were just blank. And I was thinking, well, maybe that had something to do with not watching all of the class videos and so on. With the class time, what I'm trying to do is clear up any questions that you have over the material, and at the same time, kind of make sure that whatever you might need to talk about for the discussions or the midterms is kind of, you know, brought up too in that time. I'm not trying to go through all of the material. There's just no way to do that. So it's important that you participate in class or at least watch it afterwards. I know I'm talking to people who are usually here, but I'm also recording. So the people who are watching it later, that could be a contributing factor also. Make sure that you go back on Blackboard to the midterm. There is an opportunity for me to put feedback on individual questions. And there's also an opportunity for me to put general feedback about your responses in general for the midterm. So I did do that in some cases. There were a couple of things that people had misunderstandings about. And so in that feedback is where I clarified that. One of them was humanism. I read in a few of the responses that people stopped believing in religion and started focusing on themselves. And that is not a good definition of humanism. And there were more people than I would like to have seen who wrote that. And so it's just important to remember that humanism does not take over religion. The two can cohabitate. It's just with humanism, we start to believe in the Renaissance, people start to think, well, maybe I can make some choices or some decisions that will affect the outcome of my life. I don't have to rely on God to do it all. It doesn't mean that people aren't believing in God. It just means that, you know, God helps those who help themselves, kind of a thing. Um, the other one that I saw that was a little bit confusing for people was the idea of the romance. And that's going to come up today because we're going to start talking about the Romantic period, which builds on that same idea. So the romance that we read was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And, you know, it's a story of chivalry and morality and, you know, knights and ladies and all of that sort of thing. That's a romance. But I got some answers on the test that were like, well, it's when two people fall in love. And really, that doesn't have anything to do with the literary idea of romantic. So we're going to talk about that today as we're beginning the romantic movement. But I do think you should go back and look at your feedback and see if, as I've notes, I didn't leave notes on everybody's exams, but there might be some notes from yours if there's something I need to clarify for you, or I felt like I needed to explain a grade reduction or something like that. But for the most part, I feel like people did pretty well. And you know, just keep in mind that the final exam will be exactly like that, except for the second half material. I think maybe we should start with the Gulliver's Travel Study Guide. I tried to pick an image for my background today that was kind of like, I am big and this town is tiny, but I don't know if I was successful or not. All right, so Gulliver's Travels, there is a discussion this week. Your discussion number 6, I believe it is about Gulliver's Travels. So I want to touch base on any questions that you might have. You can put numbers in the chat if you want me to talk about a specific question, knowing that sometimes the study guide previews the exam. So sometimes I'll pull out questions that are on the exam or quotations. So take a few minutes. I'm going to talk in general about Gulliver's Travels now that you've read the whole thing. And while I'm talking, if you have questions that you want me to touch on, just to give you more notes or to give you more explanation on any of them, just put them in the chat and I will respond to them. But I think that the main thing to remember about this section that we read of Gulliver's Travels is that it's a satire. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the idea that it's a, you know, fun story, and it is fun to read. It's a narrative. The guy's in a, you know, sort of fantasy, strange environment. And, you know, it talks about the ups and downs of his experiences with the Lilliputians and their neighbors. But it's important to remember that it's a satire, and there are 3 main things that are being satirized, but really every little thing that Gulliver does and it relates in his story is sort of related to existence and life in his time period. So even the little details are sometimes criticism of his society, but in general, he's criticizing 3 things: politics and religion, and especially relations between England and France. So the way that he satirizes the religious differences between people at the time, this is a time after the Reformation. So there are Catholics and there are Protestants. And the way that he satirizes them is by having the Lilliputians debate or choose sides on which end of the egg is better to crack, like a hard-boiled egg, so that you can get the egg out. Big Endians and little Endians are what they're called. Endians, not Indians. And so it's trivial, right? Like, who cares what side the egg comes out as long as the egg comes out of the shell? Nobody cares. And so in that way, Swift is making fun of religion or the division between religions, because he's saying, well, it's all one God. There's slightly different beliefs, but ultimately you get the egg. So what's the big deal? And it's a huge deal for them. It goes back generations about big endians and little endians, and you find out that it has to do with which end of the egg you crack when you're getting your egg out. Um, so there's that criticism. He also uses the he's got political parties that he mentions, and if you want to spell them correctly, they're here on number 3. The Lilliputians have Slimexins and Tremexins. That's hard to say. And they are the ones with the big heels or the little heels on their shoes. And that goes back to a criticism of court at the time, but also a criticism of political parties, right? That there's differences between them, but they're not as significant as they would have you believe. And there's a lot of detail in the story about that, but I don't see anything in the chat, so I guess everybody gets that one. The other one is the representation of England as the Lilliputians and Blefuscrians, it's hard to say. Also, these are all made up names, of course, represent France. And so when Gulliver sort of goes to visit those Blefuscians, they see that in Lilliput as kind of a slight. And actually, they end up using that as one of the reasons that they are going to exile him and blind him and kick him off of their island. But those two represent England and France. And the reason I mention that is because discussion number 6, go back over here to the discussions in Blackboard. Discussion number 6 is due on Friday, and that one it asks the question, in what way does Lilliput represent British society? So I'm giving you the 3 main ones. You should look for other details in the text, not just, you know, the egg one, and write about how you see him satirizing other elements of the society. It says, we know that Swift is one of the writers most associated with satire, so this would mean that within the text, there are examples of veiled criticism of his own society. So where do you see other examples of that kind of criticism? Maybe you have to think back to when you were in world history or European history. If you took AP, you know, Euro AP, then you might have to go back to thinking about what you learned in those classes to think what was British society like at the time, because it's hard to know what he's criticizing if you don't know what the society was. I also put some links down here. I mentioned this last time. There's some links down here that might help you understand what was going on in Swift's time, so that you can see how he is satirizing his society. So that's why I mentioned those 3 comparisons between Lilliput and real Britain, so that you can start to see some of those connections. But you should look for more of them and, you know, try to gain a basis for what he's trying to say about society on multiple levels. I don't see anything in the chat about any of these questions. Are there any that you want me to go over? You can send me a private chat if you want. Probably you noticed on the midterm that a lot of the quotes that showed up on the midterm were also in the study guide. So if you had already thought about them, then that was probably an easier response. Number 11, on the first part? I think you mean on the first part here. Okay. Yeah, so it's a quotation. Explain the significance of the quotation. Taking them one by one out of my pocket, I observed both the soldiers and people were highly delighted at this mark of my clemency, which was represented very much to my advantage at court. So he's talking here about the scene when he acts like he's going to eat one of them, and instead he puts them in his pocket and eventually releases them. And so clemency is like freedom, or giving somebody their freedom. And, you know, of course they tie him down at first because they're fearful of his size and his power, compared to, you know, like their size and power in their little houses back there. And so they're reluctant to release him, but there's a moment where he shows mercy and he could eat them or crush their skulls, or he says he wants to, but he decides not to. And so that is sort of a vote of loyalty or confidence in Gulliver, because he could have hurt a whole great bunch of them, but he doesn't. And so it was to his advantage in court, because when he goes to court and they're trying to decide what to do with him, they are concerned about his size. They're concerned about how much he's eating, that they might starve because they're trying to feed him. But they take it as a sign that he's benign, you know, that he's not harmful to them, that he, you know, didn't hurt the Lilliputians when he could have. So that's the significance of that quotation. Anything else? What else? We're here to clarify all of your reading. You could also ask other questions. You know, I have these questions here as sort of a guideline of what you should have picked up from your reading. You should be able to answer all these questions, but if you have your own questions, I can answer them too. All right, well, if you think of something, you can put it in there and I'll take a look at it before we sign off today, just to make sure everybody gets their notes satisfied and all of that stuff. I'm gonna head on over to Blackboard here and go to Unit 4, which is the new one that posted today. I wanna kind of walk you through this unit a little bit, and then I want to talk about the reading assignments that are coming up, and also do some notes on the Romantic period for you. But if you go to Blackboard, the first thing that you'll notice in the unit for the Romantic period is that there's a new PDF. The other PDF finished. It's a 2-book textbook. This is what the textbook looks like. And it's got a first half and a second half of the time periods. So those, we're switching over to the second one now. So there's a new PDF. The link is here. You might want to download it. I think it scrolls faster when you download than it does when you have it on a Google Drive, and it has to catch up a lot. And I don't know, I'm impatient, so I downloaded it. It's easier to scroll. But keep in mind that the page numbers from here on out are from this new PDF. There's some introductory material here that you will want to read through. The objectives for Unit 4 are similar to the previous units. This one relates to Romanticism, but all the skills are pretty much the same in terms of looking at literature and writing about it. Here are the readings. I put the book in there again really big, just so that you can have a copy of it there. You can see that I broke the readings for the Romantic period into 3 sections, because this is the reading for Thursday, which will be the 1st, I think. And then this grouping is the readings for next Tuesday, and then the reading for next Thursday is here. So there's 3 class periods that we'll be talking about the Romantic period. And the first one that we'll have on Thursday will include everything that's in parentheses. Now, you don't need to read everything by Charlotte Smith, just the ones that are listed here. So the page numbers are listed just for the ones that you need to read. Background of the author, and then the pieces are listed. So anything that's in parentheses is what you need to prepare. This one's for Thursday, this one's for Tuesday. So on Thursday, we're going to look at the Romantic period poets, Smith, Burns, and Wordsworth. And then next Tuesday, we'll look at the kings of romantic poetry, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, and then Mary Wollstonecraft. That's an essay that we'll look at for next Thursday. There's some notes about Romanticism. I'm going to talk about it briefly, but there's some more detailed things here that you should read. Here are the discussion assignments for the new unit, 7 and 8. There will be a total of 10. There were originally 12, but I reduced that after Stormageddon. Here's where you can always find the videos of the lectures after we finish. I post them on YouTube and then I link them here. So you can always get, whatever you might be missing and other materials. Here's the textbook again and the new one. And then here is the slideshow that I'm going to be using today. And I'll add to this other materials section as we go through the unit. So the key thing to remember is that there's that new PDF for part 2 of the textbook that you should be using. I don't want you to go looking for it in the old PDF because it won't be there. It's a 2-book thing. So let me give some notes on the Romantic period. I'm also, if you're just joining us, also I'm still taking question numbers on the Gulliver's Travel Study Guide. If you have questions that you want me to talk about, you can put the number in there and I'll look at that before we go today to see what you might like for me to discuss. All right, so some notes on the Romantic period. Let me go through those. First, I always like to talk about the historical influences on the time period, how we're traveling through time in those historical kind of ways, and then I'll talk about the literature specifically. So the time that we're talking about for the Romantic period starts toward the end of the 18th century up till about 1832, which is when we start to move into the Victorian era. So just as a time frame, this is the time frame between American independence and the Civil War. So just like for an American perspective on it, obviously the British have a different viewpoint on the revolution, but that's the time frame that we're looking at here. During this time, there were many debates about the abolition of slavery, both in America and in Europe. America wasn't the only place that had slaves, right? If you remember the Triangle Trade, there were slaves also in Britain. And eventually it was outlawed much earlier in Britain than it was in the United States. It took the Civil War and other acts for the abolition of slavery to take hold in the United States. But in Britain, slavery ended in 1807. So kind of early on into the Romantic period. Also during this time, we have the French Revolution, which was about personal rights. Same thing, the American Revolution had already taken place, but the idea is still present that people are fighting for their individual rights and not to be controlled by their government or held down. We've talked about this in previous lessons, but we continue to see a move toward industrialization and away from agriculture, which affects things like pastoral poetry and things of the past like that. So there's a change into the industrial age that's continuing now into the early 19th century. Laissez-faire is a term that I'm sure that you've heard before. They mention it a lot in history courses, or at least they always mentioned it in my history courses, but it has to do in this case with the industrialization of Britain, because there's this sort of laissez-faire attitude, which is like sort of let it alone, right? Leave them to their own devices, let them eat cake kind of way of doing business. And that led to a lot of issues in industry, especially with labor and the fair treatment of workers. So because the bosses and the people owning the companies would just be like, well, they get what they get, they're poor. And of course, the poor people suffered as a result of that. Horrible working conditions, people working, there were no regulations about how long a person could work, without a break, how many days a week or hours. Nowadays, if you have a job, you know that every 4 hours that you work, you get a 15-minute break, or if you work a certain length of time, you get a half an hour lunch. That's all part of the regulations and labor that we have today, but they didn't have any of that. Age limits, they had children working in factories, and there's nothing about safety of the equipment, no concerns for any of those things. So the working conditions were pretty deplorable, mainly because of that laissez-faire attitude. And I think I've already touched on this, but the idea that the poor suffer and the wealthy prosper off of their labor, we could probably argue that that's still going on today in many cases. But this isn't a history class, so moving on to talk about the idea of romantic. Okay, so romantic is a term that is unrelated to interpersonal relationships. It's not about love relationships between people. Even when we go back to the romance of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it's not about courting or love. The only thing that really happens is that, Bertilac's wife comes on to Gawain, but he doesn't give into it. So romantic with a capital R has a totally different meaning than when we say, oh, giving roses to somebody is romantic. So it's about looking at things with a blurry lens, right? Looking at things not as they really are, but through an idealist lens. It's about being idealistic. So, like think about your Instagram filters or your beauty mode on TikTok. It's about changing things so that they appear more ideal. And so the literature of the time period goes along with that. And I might take a selfie and I don't like the way that it's got a shadow over here, or like this wrinkle showing or whatever, and so I can go to the filters and I can filter all that out. And so the romantic viewpoint is like filtering out life, and having a romantic outlook is like looking at the ideal and trying to perceive what that could be. Probably it's significant to mention that this is a period named after literary and artistic qualities, not after who was ruling. We have the Victorian era, we have the Elizabethan era, we have the Jacobean era. But during this time period, the study of art and the artistic qualities of romantic ideals outshines the monarchy. And I mean, they're there and everything, but the idea is that what becomes more important in this time is actually the pursuit of literary and artistic activities, pieces. We see also a revival of medieval and classical pieces. In a lot of the literature that we're going to read, the poems even, there will be references to medieval romances, meaning like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, also Arthur, things like that, and also classicism, which is the study of ancient texts, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, because the Romantics thought that those were more ideal times, and they look back on them as long ago days where everything was beautiful and wonderful. Probably wasn't, but it's kind of nice to look back, kind of like the way you might look back and say, oh, things were so simple in the 1950s or the 1980s. It would have been great to have lived during that time because life was a lot simpler than it is now. And so they do the same thing and they look back to those different periods for the same reason. So for that reason, nostalgia is quite strong. The nostalgia is the sort of looking back over your past and not looking more at the positive parts than the negative parts, right? We all do that. Probably important, again, I've mentioned this a few times, that these periods aren't named at the time that they're developing, they're named after the fact. So we look back and we say, oh, you know what, during this time frame, people were approaching literature or art or their society in a certain way, and so we can label them. But we only do that after the fact, like in retrospect. And the Romantic movement actually was named by the next group of artists, writers, thinkers, called the Victorians, and they thought that it was sort of putting down the Romantics. They're kind of saying, the Victorians are sort of, not perfectionists, they're realists, and they don't go in for this sort of fantasy romantic concept. And so when they called their predecessors romantic, they were sort of throwing some shade at them and saying, oh, they had their head in the clouds, they weren't thinking about reality, they were, you know, just thinking about beauty and love and writing about that stuff. We Victorians are pragmatic, and we're here for the grisly, you know, ugly parts of life to expose them. And you get Charles Dickens, who's writing about orphans on the street of London and stuff like that. So it's usually the case that we later look back and label times, kind of like the way that we label generations nowadays. You know, we label the millennials, and I'm Gen X, and the boomers, and, you know, people kind of throw shade at each other back and forth. You know, like Gen X's are usually like rolling their eyes at millennials, and millennials are kind of like, okay, boomer. And it's kind of like that between all the movements of literature as we continue moving through. Everybody reacts in an opposite way to the previous generation. You know, whatever your parents did, whatever clothing styles they wear, whatever music they listen to, we tend to go in a different direction because we don't want to be just like that previous generation. All right, characteristics of Romantic era literature. Eclecticism is the first one. Now, this is a link. You can go and find out more about eclecticism if you need to. I'm going to give a general overview of it. But eclecticism comes from the word eclectic, which means like having a variety of patterns. So a person who's eclectic is somebody that you can't really nail them down. They have lots of interests, and they're sort of personalities that aren't clearly defined. And for the people in the Romantic period, this represented a real shift in thinking because people started to accept that different people have different perspectives on things, and not everybody has your own perspective. And so we start to have a little more understanding or interest in understanding what others are going through in eclecticism. There are other elements to it, but that's basically what we need to know for what we're going to be reading. Oops, I didn't mean to click on that. There. Also, we have in literature during this time period the rise of the female voice. We'll read one poet and one essayist during this unit that start to talk about female issues in terms of representation. This is sort of where we get the genesis of the suffrage movement, and the female voice is starting to come through. We haven't really read very many female writers. I guess you could say The Wife of Bath, but technically her character was written by a man. So we start to hear from women in literature as serious writers, and it doesn't mean that they didn't exist previously. It just means that they weren't highlighted because of society's views of women writers. In terms of poetry in Romanticism, we start to see more of nature as a character. So you'll see that a lot of the poems refer to, you know, the sun, and they're talking to the sun, or they're talking to the clouds, or the clouds are a character and they're speaking, you know, they're personified in that way, not just for something for humans to look at and have a jumping off philosophical point. Like the piece of nature, the woods, you know, the tree limb is an actual character, the flowers that the poet is talking to often. Poetry also is an overflow of emotion. Romantic poetry sometimes seems overly flowery to us sometimes. Oh, the skies put forth, you know, the rain. And, you know, it's sort of like overly emotional for what they're writing about. And that's sort of what makes them romantic, because they're looking at the ideal of nature and beauty and all of that stuff. I would probably put a star by this one. If I had to say, this is one of the most important things to remember about Romantic era literature, and that is the glorification of things that are normal, things that are simple and ordinary. They didn't wait for moments of grand, you know, a grand event in order to immortalize it. writing about it or painting about it. So you'll see artwork and writing that's sometimes about quiet things, simple things, things that are basic. And those things are revered over things that are exotic or flashy and that sort of thing. Individualism and alienation goes back to the image that I showed you at the beginning of the slideshow. Because of this individual perception and people creating, there's a lot of individualism that's accepted. Different people went different ways with their freedoms. And also sometimes that causes separation and alienation, because the romantic writer is perceived in general as somebody who, you know, like broods in his corner room, trying to come up with the best poetry, and isolates himself in order to create it. We see a lot of first person speakers, narratives to dramatize certain situations. So there's a lot of drama in the poetry as well, usually from a first person speaker, or a lot of times from a first person speaker. I took out some, when I had to take some things out of this unit, one of the things that I took out is some of the Gothic pieces. You can go here and read about Gothic literature, but this is the time period where we place that. So the Gothic has sort of a dark element to it. This is when Frankenstein gets published toward the end of the Romantic era. So there's this intersection between the Romantic world and sort of the macabre world that starts to happen in the Gothic. Also, as we've been seeing as we go through time, it's a more prolific age of literary production. We start to see more literature being produced at this time more than any other time, and that just keeps growing from time period to time period. So more people are literate, more people can afford books. Books are more plentiful because there are more printing presses. So there's more and more literature abounding as we come up through these middle eras into our modern time. The last characteristic that I have of Romantic era literature is probably what I would say is the bottom line to remember about Romantic period. And that is ars gratia artis, art for art's sake. People weren't writing or creating art to make a point as much as they were doing it because art is beautiful. Art for art's sake is the concept there. And so I'm not like John Milton trying to make a point about sin and how people should behave. I'm not like Jonathan Swift trying to criticize my society and my art is for that purpose. The Romantics kind of said, sometimes you can just create art because it's beautiful. You can create a poem that doesn't have a distinct meaning. It's just a celebration of an image. It's just a beautiful line of poetry or stanza or whatever. Same thing with artwork. You can see this term still today. MGM, if you've ever been to a movie or watched a movie where they have this beginning, this in the beginning credits and the lion roars, the phrase ars gratia artis is part of that logo right here. So, you know, art for art's sake isn't completely gone. The ideas of the Romantic era still linger even today. Let's make something just because we can and just because it's beautiful for others to see. There are a few writers. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but I do want you to notice when I was getting this slideshow ready, I noticed that all the portraits of the different writers from this time period have a very distinct style. There's always like a serious look on the face. They look preoccupied with something. Usually they have a book or a pencil or something like that, but always a really dark background and then a really pale foreground. And we call that in art chiaroscuro, but you can see in this picture of William Blake, I don't think we're gonna read anything from William Blake, but you can see that his figure definitely sticks out because of the dark background, but you'll start to get a little humorous when you notice that they're pretty much all like that. All portraits were kind of done like that. Here's Mary Wollstonecraft. We're gonna read one of her essays. There's the preoccupied look, the dark background, the light foreground. Wordsworth We'll read a few things by William Wordsworth as well. He's definitely deep in thought. He's got that romantic sort of cloudy idea in the background swinging around behind him. Percy Shelley, we'll be reading a few things by Percy Shelley. His wife was Mary Shelley. She wrote Frankenstein. But you can see he's definitely standing out from the background there. And Keats, they all have the sort of like that graduation pose in a way, graduation photo pose. There's Keats, book and pen, and Lord Byron. So they all have this sort of contemplative, thinking about art for art's sake kind of look to them. But it's good to know a few of the names from the time period. I would definitely make note of those. All right, I'm looking to see if there's anything else in the chat that you would like for me to address from the Gulliver's Travel Study Guide. And I don't see anything else. Anybody want to add to that from the study guide? You should be able to answer all these questions then. If you don't need me to talk about them, then you should be prepared to answer them on the exam or, you know, that kind of thing. All right, so I don't have room on the calendar. Let me see, we're moving to Thursday to put in the page numbers that you need to read for the romantic poetry before class on Thursday, but I did link them over here where you go to the romantic period unit, you can go to the readings and all the page numbers are there because I've only selected certain poems by these poets. So anything that's in parentheses is what you should read. The first 4 bullets are for Thursday, and then these 3 bullets are for next Tuesday. Remember that we have Friday off and also Monday for Easter. We have a 4-day weekend coming up this week. So we only have 4 days this week and 4 days next week. So this is for Tuesday next week. And then the Mary Wollstonecraft essay is for Thursday. Are there any questions before we go today? Anybody have anything from the study guide or anything about the readings for Thursday? All right, well, I guess that's it. If you have a specific question, definitely you can communicate that to me through your email, and I will see you on Thursday to start looking at some romantic period poetry. Have a good day.
Bye, Miss.
Bye.